What sort of man thinks of electrocution, poison gas, and strangulation for a living?
There are more than 2,300 prisoners on death row. Tonight, the man who makes the gallows and designs electric chairs. The country's reigning expert on execution.
I honestly have no problems with my conscience about what I do, and I'm very happy to be able to minimize the suffering.
What is the fastest, most painless execution? Tonight, the art and science of death.
From ABC News, with anchors Diane Sawyer, Sam Donaldson, Chief Correspondent Chris Wallace, Judd Rose, and Jay Shadler. From New York, this is Prime Time. Coming up, 124 people have been executed in the United States since the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976. Tonight at the Potosi Correctional Facility in Missouri, convicted murderer Winford Stokes is scheduled to become the 125th. The method will be lethal injection. The device was designed by this man, Fred Lucher. Coming up, we'll introduce you to the man who earns a living making and repairing execution equipment. When Prime Time continues.
And then I came back to AT&T, and you would think...
Channel 5. When Prime Time continues, it started when he was a kid. Fred Lucher would tag along when his father went to work. It so happened his father worked at a prison.
He always was interested in electricity and stuff like that.
I would prefer to be electrocuted. It's faster than all of the other systems.
He should know, when it comes to electric chairs, gallows, you name it, he's Dr. Death, the expert on execution equipment. And we'll take you to Sky Island, a remarkable vista in Arizona, where Sam Donaldson explores a Prime Time from New York continues. Once again, Diane Sawyer.
There was an execution in Florida last week that was at once riveting and horrifying. Jesse Joseph Tefero, convicted of killing 2 police officers, became the 217th person to die in Florida's electric chair. But last week at the state penitentiary in Florida, it took not 1, but 3 jolts of 2,000-volt electricity before prison officials were done, and each time the flames shot out from the electrodes strapped to the prisoner's head. Governor Barb Martinez ordered an investigation.
On Friday, May 4th, we did carry out the death warrant on Jesse Joseph Tefero.
It was a few minutes after 7 in the morning at the prison in Stark, Florida. Inside, 43-year-old Jesse Joseph Tefero was buckled into the oak chair, his face hooded. Newspaper reporter Bruce Ritchie, as part of his job, was there to witness.
As soon as it hit, the body reeled back in the chair. It seemed like a little bit more than usual. It slammed back against the back of the chair. And there was some reddish, dark reddish flames coming from the left side of his head. And then they stopped, and then all of a sudden the body just rose. And then his shoulders lifted. And then he just let out a breath. And then he did it again and let out a breath. And I noticed that his heart seemed to be beating.
In a 7-minute period, there would be 2 more deadly charges. And each time, there would be flames. The state says the problem was the sponge. A 30-year-old natural sponge attached to the head electrode had been replaced with a synthetic, and it turns out, flammable sponge. Even so, Department of Corrections Secretary Richard Duggar says Tefero didn't suffer. That heartbeat or not, he was dead after the first jolt.
In my opinion, death occurs instantly when you apply high voltage directly to the brain of someone. I don't believe there's any way to avoid an instant death.
You're basically dealing with what would at least appear to be incompetence.
Billy Nolis is the attorney for convicted murderer Benny Demps, who was going to be executed in that same chair until it was postponed 2 days ago.
We don't torture people in this country. Presumably we don't burn people at the stake in this country.
Even though, according to polls, 79% of Americans favor the death penalty, very few of us stop to contemplate the deadly specifics, the levers pulled, the toxins injected, coursing electricity. Yet what happened in Florida last week started us thinking about the people who do just that. In particular, a man in Boston who is the nation's foremost expert on execution. If you were expecting someone dour and grim, you were probably going to be a little bit unsettled by Fred Lucher, whose business is death.
If the equipment is not up to par, if the equipment does not have the right voltage, if you do not have the proper and tight-fitting electrodes, you will cause pain, undue trauma to the individual's body prior to his death.
It's just another problem to be solved, another day at the office for Fred Lucher, a man who makes his livelihood perfecting the instruments of death.
I am a proponent of capital punishment, but I'm not a proponent of capital torture. Hanging is probably almost as humane as the other systems in place. There is one instant of pain when the spinal cord is snapped. I'll set this for a guy weighing about 160 pounds, and that should be close enough.
Only 3 states still kill by hanging: Oklahoma, Washington State, and Delaware, one of Lucher's clients. Brooke Lagner is Delaware's Director of Prison Services.
We have 7 people on death row right now who have the option of selecting either the hanging, the old method, or they can elect to choose the lethal injection method.
Brooke had contacted me to supply the state of Delaware with a lethal injection machine. While we were working on the details, a necessity arose to construct a gallows.
A necessity because a death row inmate surprised prison officials by asking to be hanged.
I spent a great deal of time in the medical library studying British procedures, since they had the best track record for hanging. If the hanging is not done properly, 2 things may occur. First, if the individual is dropped too short a distance, he will slowly strangle, and he will suffer for approximately 4 to 5 minutes before he passes out. The second problem is if the individual is dropped too far a distance, at which point decapitation results. I honestly have no problems with my conscience about what I do, and I'm very happy to be able to minimize the suffering that the executee faces.
Lucher grew up around prisons and inmates. His father worked at the Massachusetts Department of Corrections and took his young son along.
He was always interested in going to the prison with me. He liked that. And, but I never thought he'd go into the prison to work.
Or at least a kind of prison work. So far, about the only death-dealing device Lucher hasn't made is a gas chamber, although he does consulting work for states like North Carolina.
This is the chair that the executee sits in during his execution. It was originally an electric chair used at this very same institution. The hydrogen cyanide gas used in this chamber is actually generated in a small metal box under the chair and within the chamber. This chair has been especially modified with a metal box with a trapdoor directly beneath the seat. The trapdoor drops sodium cyanide pellets into a metal container of sulfuric acid beneath the chamber. The trapdoor mechanism in the chair is controlled electronically from a control room. 3 keys operate the trapdoor mechanism. 3 executioners turn the keys. Only 1 key actually operates the device, and no one knows which key does it. The total time to death should be approximately 4 minutes.
We got a hold of Fred a few years ago. We were going to redo our gas chamber.
Bill Armentrout is warden of the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City.
This thing is antiquated. It was a 1938-39 vintage, and Fred was the only one in the country we found that did that type work now.
The prime problem with gas is that gas is extremely dangerous for those people operating the system. Any leak could cause instant death for as many as 25 or 30 people who are either participating or watching the execution.
We had Fred come out and give us an estimate on refurbishing the gas chamber and completely rebuilding it, constructing a new one. And about the same time this happened, the state legislature then passed a lethal injection bill for the state of Missouri. And so we went ahead and purchased a lethal injection machine from Fred. We were the first to use his machine. In January of last year, we used it on Georgetown and Mercer. And then again, we used it this spring on Gerald Smith, and it worked perfectly. And also it gave the operators a feeling that you didn't know who actually did the execution. There's 2 buttons to push simultaneously, and there's a computer chip with no memory, so you don't really know who did the execution.
This is the relay that activates the electric chair that actually...
Lucher has also designed and installed equipment for electric chairs.
As an individual who is familiar with all types of execution procedures and hardware, if I had my druthers, I would prefer to be electrocuted. It's faster than all of the other systems. It's just as effective and every bit as much painless.
Unless you're James Joseph Tafaro, who was burned by flames in that Florida execution. No one will ever know if he felt pain, but Lucher looked at the photographs and told us he thinks the prison diagnosis of the problem is wrong.
The burning that we have on sponge number 2, at least as far as I'm able to tell from the photographs, is consistent with the type of burning that we would get from a broken or defective electrode. And that would indicate that it was not the sponge. There's a good possibility that this will happen again in the future. Maybe not on the next one, but on a subsequent execution.
A final word about this man who practices the art and science of death. So far, he has never seen an execution by one of his devices, though he says he will someday, and doesn't fear any crisis of conscience about his grim career.
My feeling is that if I wasn't doing this and I wasn't manufacturing the equipment, these people that are being executed would be suffering. And it's my hope that the people that are executed, whether they be in the United States or for that matter throughout the world, will be dispatched painlessly and quickly.
Well, you know, we looked at that piece, and a lot of us said to ourselves, it's eerie, is it ghoulish? And yet at the same time, if a country is going to favor the death penalty, I guess we ought to be willing to face the reality of what it takes.
I agree. I think executions ought to be telecast. Now that sounds...
Telecast?
Yeah, I think that's horrible, you say, but I think people ought to face the consequences of public policy. Remember, the Vietnam War was brought into the living rooms, and people said after a while, wait a second, I don't think we want to do this. So I think if executions are brought into the living rooms, people have to face that when you pull that switch, you watch people die.
What about children? Do you want children to watch that?
Well, I don't think I want children to watch it, but I want parents to control children on television on any size program.
I'm not sure you could, though. Would it be worth it?
Well, it's not pornography, except to some people it is. And I mean, that's the point that I'm trying to make. Watch an execution, see what the consequences are of a policy which says this is what we want the law to do. And then if you're for the death penalty, fine. You have a better understanding of it. Maybe you won't be for the death penalty.
I think it is interesting that Fred Lucher has never witnessed an execution by one of his machines. We'll be right back in a moment.